My husband Eric and I were in Chicago, a trip thoughtfully gifted by our daughter Sarah. It was meant to be a joyful getaway, but fate had other plans. During our trip, we unexpectedly ran into my ex-fiancé, now a doctor, surrounded by the same group of friends who once drove a wedge between us. Their condescending looks were unmistakable, and soon they began to hurl insults our way. One of them sneered, "Don't you know who I am?" I was stunned, but Eric's sharp response left them speechless, turning the entire situation on its head. My name is Jennifer, and at 48 years old, I live with my loving husband Eric. Our daughter Sarah, now grown and independent, is busy navigating her career and personal life. She visits us occasionally, sharing stories about her latest adventures, and it's clear she's thriving. Her happiness is our greatest joy. Sarah, however, isn't Eric's biological child. Her real father passed away from illness when she was just 4. It was an unbearably painful time for both of us, and the grief lingered for a long time. But then, someone entered our lives who helped us rediscover happiness, though that same person would later betray our trust. 19 years ago, a tragedy struck again. Eric suddenly collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. Despite the doctor's efforts, he passed away a few months later. Losing him shattered me. I was consumed by grief and struggled to care for Sarah, who was still so young. Work became impossible, and I couldn't find the strength to continue. My mother, Isabella, recognizing my despair, came to stay with us and gently suggested I see a psychiatrist. "You've been through so much. You need someone to talk to," she urged. Dr. Brian, the psychiatrist she recommended, was compassionate and attentive. His clinic, run alongside his father, was always bustling with patients, yet he found time to genuinely care about Sarah, knowing she, too, was suffering from her father's death. He recommended that Sarah attend sessions with me, though at the time, I was too lost in my own sorrow to realize the depth of her pain. I blamed myself, feeling like I had failed as a mother. The idea that my daughter might be better off without me even crossed my mind. Losing someone you've built your life with blinds you to anything beyond your own grief. Dr. Brian never dismissed my emotions. He provided not just medication, but real emotional support. He handed me his business card with his personal phone number, encouraging me to call if I ever needed help. I was hesitant at first, unsure if I should burden him outside of sessions, but deep down, I knew that if things got truly desperate, that card could be a lifeline. There was a point where I reached rock bottom, mentally drained to the point of considering the unthinkable, leaving Sarah behind. In that moment, I called Dr. Brian. He listened patiently, offering words of comfort and guidance that eased my distress. Just as I was about to hang up, he said, "If you're comfortable, I can give you my ID so you can reach out anytime. Sometimes, just talking can make a difference." We began exchanging messages, and with Dr. Brian's steady support, I slowly started to regain my strength. As the days passed, my thoughts of my late husband began to fade, and eventually, I felt well enough to return to work. One day, I sent Dr. Brian a message, thanking him for helping me through such a dark time. His reply, however, caught me completely off guard. "If it's all right with you, Jennifer," he said, "I'd like to be a part of your life beyond just our sessions." I was stunned. It had never crossed my mind that Dr. Brian might have romantic feelings for me. He knew I was a widow, still grieving, and yet here he was, confessing something I hadn't expected. "I fell in love with you from the moment we met," he continued. "I really like you, and I would never abandon you. Would you consider being in a relationship with me?" I was speechless. The idea that Dr. Brian, my psychiatrist, could feel this way about a patient seemed impossible. He was handsome and clearly took care of himself, and I couldn't help but wonder why he would be interested in someone like me, a single mother still recovering from her loss. Surely, he had his pick of women more glamorous and exciting than me, but as I processed his confession, I knew I had to be honest with him about my own feelings. "You're the only one for me," I told him. "I can't even think about anyone else." With Dr. Brian, as I began calling him, being such an important figure in Sarah's life, I agreed to start dating him. In hindsight, I realize it might have been risky for a doctor to pursue a relationship with a patient, especially someone in my position, but Brian's sincerity and devotion seemed so genuine, I couldn't help but trust him. After about a year of dating, Brian proposed. Sarah was thrilled, and after discussing it with her, we eagerly agreed to be engaged. Brian treated Sarah with such love and attention, and on weekends, the two of them would go to the park together, building a strong bond. I was grateful for how well he embraced his role in her life. One weekend, at the park, I met a woman named Maria and her daughter, Rachel. While the kids played, I noticed Brian and Maria chatting easily. He was charming and attentive, not just to Maria but to all the other moms there, which reassured me. It felt natural to trust him completely. After all, he was already a part of our lives, and we weren't even married yet. When I thanked Brian for being so wonderful with my mom friends, he just laughed. "That's normal," he said. "Once we're married, it's just what happens." Everything seemed perfect. I truly believed Brian was the right man for me. But then, out of nowhere, something shook my world. One day at the park, little Rachel innocently said, "Brian's going to be my dad soon, right? Since he'll be Sarah's dad too. That's going to be hard." Her words left me momentarily stunned, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a child's fantasy. Brian was great with kids, and it wasn't surprising that Rachel might look up to him. I didn't think much of it, but that night, as we were winding down, Brian sat me down and said something I never saw coming. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice serious, "but let's forget about the marriage." Confusion washed over me, and I immediately demanded to know why. "I've fallen for someone else," he confessed. My mind raced back to Rachel's earlier comment. "Is it Maria, Rachel's mom?" I asked, my heart sinking. Brian's face turned pale, and he looked visibly flustered. It was clear he hadn't intended to reveal his feelings for Maria so soon, especially since she was married. The realization struck me hard. He had been pursuing a relationship with a woman who was already committed. "You're going after a married woman, the mother of Sarah's friend?" My voice trembled with anger and betrayal. "You're choosing Maria over me and Sarah? That's despicable." Tears streamed down my face as I confronted him. "Shut up," he snapped back, his tone harsh and unyielding. I was taken aback by the sudden shift in his demeanor. Fortunately, Sarah was staying at my parents' house at the time, so she wasn't there to witness this painful exchange. Brian's hurtful words cut deep. "Maria is more beautiful than you," he continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "We're more physically compatible. You've been rejecting me lately because of Sarah." His shallow reasoning infuriated me. How could he value looks and physical compatibility over the deep emotional connection we had built? In that moment, I realized it didn't matter. This was not the man I thought I knew, and I refused to let his betrayal define my worth. 2. Whether it was Brian or Maria who initiated it didn't matter. Both had betrayed me. Brian was my fiancé, and Maria was a married woman. Their actions were nothing short of appalling. Still reeling from the shock, I was further devastated by Brian's cruel remark. I was drawn to the idea of a grieving widow. He admitted, "I liked your appearance. Well, your clothes and hair were a bit shabby, but that widow look really hit my fetish." His words were both hurtful and confusing. "I wanted to mess you up," It was never about loving you for who you are. He continued coldly. I kept treating you because I didn't want another doctor to take you away. It was a mistake that you recovered so well. Maybe that's thanks to my efforts as your doctor. I should have kept you coming back to the hospital. I struggled to comprehend the twisted logic behind his verbal abuse. With each word, I became more disillusioned with the man I once trusted. Enough, I said firmly, a steely resolve settling in. Let's break up. And of course, you'll owe me compensation for breaking off our engagement. For a moment, Brian looked surprised, but desperation to be with Maria quickly overtook him. Well, I'm a doctor, and money is no object for me. Here, take it. With your appearance, you should go to a beauty salon, but then again, you're a single mother now, so maybe not. Thus, my relationship with the despicable Brian came to a bitter end. I also demanded compensation from Maria. Being a single mother, you'll need money. Fine, I'll donate this to you. In return, I'll take Brian without hesitation. Goodbye, greedy poor person. I hadn't been close to Maria, but I never imagined she could be so morally bankrupt. At that moment, it felt like Brian and Maria were a match made in hell. Perhaps it was for the best that she took him away. A couple of months later, Maria apparently got divorced, and she and Brian left town. However, since Brian's father owned a clinic nearby, I suspected they hadn't gone far. Rachel, who had been excited about Brian becoming her dad, ended up in the custody of Maria's ex-husband. He found it too difficult to raise Rachel alone and moved back in with his parents. When Sarah learned the news, her heartbreak was palpable. Watching her cry hurt more than losing Brian ever could. In that moment, I found myself wishing for misfortune to befall both Brian and Maria. At 48, I felt disillusioned with men altogether, but then fate surprised me with a wonderful new beginning. I remarried an incredible man named Eric, who is 43 years old. He cares deeply for both Sarah and me. Although he is often busy with work, he always makes time for family. With Sarah now independent, it's just Eric and me, living like newlyweds. Then one day, Sarah surprised us with tickets to Chicago. Having received a bonus at work, she booked the hotel for us as a gesture of appreciation. Oh no, this is too much. Aren't you coming with us? I asked Sarah, surprised by her generosity. It's a gift for everything you've done for me, she replied. Go and enjoy it together. We accepted Sarah's kind offer and decided to take the trip to Chicago. It was our first trip abroad as a couple, and we had an incredible time. After a long day of sightseeing, we returned to our hotel, filled with joy. But as we walked in, a familiar voice caught my attention. To my shock, I spotted Brian and Maria at the same hotel. Who's that? Brian pointed at Eric, his tone laced with mockery. Just as I was about to answer, Brian and Maria erupted into laughter. You've remarried, but your new husband looks, I don't know, kind of poor, they jeered. It was true that Eric didn't prioritize his appearance and didn't wear flashy, brand-name clothes. Brian sneered. Excuse me, but what brand is that outfit? When Eric mentioned the name of a budget-friendly chain store, Brian and Maria burst into even louder laughter. You shop there? You're poorer than I thought. Unbelievable. Isn't that the place where only broke people go? They ridiculed Eric for simply being himself, and I was too shocked to respond. You seem to be struggling financially, yet you're on a trip to Chicago. Is that really okay? Brian taunted. Eric maintained his composure, a calm smile on his face. Actually, this trip is a gift from our daughter, and we're very grateful for it. His steady demeanor showed incredible maturity, even in the face of their cruelty. Daughter? You mean Sarah? Brian scoffed. She's an adult now. It's pathetic that you're begging your own child for a vacation. If you're going to beg, At least ask for clothes, not a trip, Maria added. Exactly. Jennifer's still living a poor life even after remarrying. Isn't that ridiculous? Their rudeness was infuriating. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but before I could say anything, Eric stepped in. Excuse me, but Jennifer is not poor. While it may be questionable for you to be a stranger, I won't tolerate any insults toward her, he said firmly. Brian laughed derisively. What are you trying to prove? Poor man? Do you even know who I am? I'm a doctor, he boasted, the sole son of a clinic owner, and I'll soon be the head doctor. Impressive, right? Eric remained unshaken. Really? You're a doctor? Yes, Brian said, his arrogance evident. Doctors are wealthy and can choose any woman they want. You poor people are in a different league. You just look poor. I couldn't bear to listen to Brian's arrogant words any longer. Maria wore a nasty smirk, reveling in the moment. But then Eric said something that completely shifted the dynamic. I think I'm actually quite well off. I run a pharmaceutical company. What? Brian's shock was palpable. Eric had inherited a major pharmaceutical company from his father, which supplied medications to Brian's hospital. I watched as Brian's expression turned ashen, realization dawning on him. Maria's panic was evident. Thank you for using our services, Eric said graciously. And in that moment, I felt myself falling for him all over again. Brian scrambled to save face. So what if you're the president of a pharmaceutical company? If the doctors decide not to use your drugs, it's over for you, right? Right, Eric replied calmly. But the decisions are made by my dad and the pharmacists, not something I interfere with. Brian's face went even paler as he began to mumble, his gaze dropping to the floor. Maria's expression mirrored his panic. Wait, did we just make a huge mistake? She asked, her voice trembling. Brian nodded, looking defeated. Yes, I've had a long relationship with your dad. We've played golf and shared meals together, so our connection has evolved from business to friendship. Hearing this, Brian bowed deeply and apologized. I'm so sorry. I'll speak to your dad, the head doctor, about this. That's not going to work, Eric said, his disappointment evident. The moment you insulted Jennifer, you crossed a line. Eric, sensing the hostile atmosphere, had started recording on his phone. Brian was now profusely apologizing. I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have called you poor, he said, desperation creeping into his tone. Eric confronted him firmly. I've heard from Jennifer that her ex-fiancé was a jerk, the worst kind. And now you're with Sarah's mom, a classmate? How much more do you need to insult Jennifer? There's a limit to how much disrespect one person can endure. Brian was left speechless by Eric's words, and an awkward silence enveloped the room. I felt a surge of happiness witnessing Eric stand up for me, and his courage inspired me to confront Brian and Maria as well. I had always believed Brian was perfectly suited for Maria. Both were adept at cheating while having a child and insulting others without a second thought. You two are truly a perfect match with your awful characters. So, thank you, Maria, for taking such a terrible man off my hands, I said, a sense of satisfaction swelling within me. What kind of nerve do you have to insult someone you've just met, especially my ex-fiancé's new husband, calling him poor? How old are you both? Are you even in your right minds? To anyone watching, you seem utterly ridiculous, I continued, my voice steady. I noticed a flicker of realization on their faces as I spoke. Brian attempted to excuse their behavior. No, we were just drunk. Seeing you after so long, and you looking so happy, we just... That excuse is unacceptable, Eric interjected. Being drunk doesn't excuse anything, and why is it sad that you can't be happy for someone else's joy? Eric addressed them firmly. "We might never meet again, but don't ever say such terrible things again." With those parting words, we turned to leave. Brian and Maria kept apologizing profusely, but Eric, still visibly furious, decided to send the recording to Brian's father. Not long after, Brian's dad called us. After we explained the situation, his anger was palpable. I had met him a few times and knew he was a strict man, so I could easily imagine the scolding Brian was about to face. He apologized to us and promised to call Brian immediately. For Brian and Maria, it was undoubtedly the worst trip to Chicago ever. If they hadn't stirred up trouble, we could have enjoyed our time at the hotel. A few days later, to our surprise, Brian's dad and the two people we thought we'd never see again showed up at our house. Maria wore light makeup, but both she and Brian had noticeably red faces, a sign of their embarrassment. "We are truly sorry for what we did," they said, their voices sincere. They acknowledged how offensive their behavior had been and offered us a substantial sum of money. Initially, we refused, but they insisted, and after some hesitation, we accepted it. With that, the three of them left, their heads hung low. According to what Brian's dad later told Eric, it seemed that Brian and Maria had gotten divorced. His father had pressured them into it, having never approved of their marriage from the start. Brian was also supposed to take over the clinic soon, but that plan was now off the table, and he faced a significant salary cut. I wasn't sure what happened to Maria afterward, but I recently heard a rumor that she was spotted working in a mature women's delivery service, looking haggard and struggling. Who could have imagined such an outcome for someone who abandoned her child and stole her classmate's fiancé? Their choices were their responsibility, not mine. As for us, while we were initially upset by the incident, a good night's sleep allowed us to feel refreshed and enjoy the remainder of our trip to Chicago. When we shared our experiences with Sarah, she laughed and said it served as a perfect example of the kind of adult not to become. I, too, felt relieved that the breakup had happened for Sarah's sake. Now, we're planning our next family vacation, eagerly anticipating another joyful trip together.